Thank you very much, and I just want to add a couple of quick remarks before getting to questions. So I think from what Saleem said, it's very clear that 1.5 degrees is very much, it's not just a mitigation goal, it's about adaptation, loss and damage. So it's very much about not only mitigation, but also avoided emissions. And I just want to briefly put that in context of what I mean by, actually there is one slide that I want to show of. I think we saw a lot of global analysis, some really good global analysis from Elmar Winkler this morning, but we really need to understand, I think one of the big steps forward in the Paris Agreement is that we are no longer in a world where we're dividing into two countries, into two groups of countries. We don't have an Annex 1, a reference to Annex 1 and one list of countries and another group of countries that is non-Annex 1. That's a very important and significant step forward. The world is not divided into two as it might have been in the 1960s. But the world is also not homogeneous. And I wanted to show this slide which is by Branko Milanovic, who uses UN statistics and wrote a great book called The Haves and the Have-Nots. And these patterns are still true as recently as 2012. And what he does is he divides the world up into groups, into ventiles, into groups of 5%. And one way of reading these is that what's still true today is that the bottom by income, the bottom 5% of Americans are as rich as the richest 5% of Indians. That's true in 2012. So when we do this analysis, and particularly when you also apply this to Africa, Africa's not on this slide, but there will be large growth in population and in higher need for energy services. You need to avoid going to high emissions before, rather than reducing later. And I think that really raises for me the question that I want to put in the discussion. We need to be clear which contexts we are speaking into. I think we need more texture. We need the global analysis, but we also need analysis that is really sensitive to the different contexts. And the final point I wanted to make is we also do need to address the question at the end of who pays. And so in the session just before, when we were talking about finance, I think that really didn't come up, because I think from the perspective of what Saleem has outlined in terms of the adaptation needs and the needs for loss and damage, as well as the needs, who actually pays for energy access in Africa, for example, if that is going to be cleaner. And those are the comments I wanted to add. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I think increasingly now we're hearing more about the regional scale, going down from the global to either the national or even to community level. So good opportunity for some questions. So we have the first question over there. Yeah.
Trying to be very careful with this. Globally, we're way off track for even 2 degrees, let alone 1.5. Paul Bayer mentioned yesterday his GDR methodology would argue very strongly that on moral grounds, it's rich countries like the UK who should make up the majority of the shortfall for 2 degrees. Would you agree with Paul Bayer's sorts of methodology that the UK should be, and other rich countries should be the ones making the majority of additional cuts? And if so, by how much precisely?
Okay, we'll bank that one. We've got the second one up here on the right. I think we saw a hand.
Saleem, it's good to see that in the Paris Agreement there is adequate representation of adaptation concerned in several articles. But when it comes to operationalization, in the coming months and years, agreement is one thing, it's only an intention, but how to operationalize that. When you come to operationalizing the Paris Agreement, my fear is that adaptation may lose out again, because whenever people want to invest, in the morning several people pleaded for investment into adaptation. But the problem is, if it is mitigation, it's much easier. If someone invests, he wants to measure, verify, report, and do all those things, MRV. But when it comes to adaptation, it's still a challenge. A lot of the things that developing countries do, all the developmental programs, watershed program, afforestation program, level, and every country has those programs. All of them are indeed adaptation. So the biggest challenge is for any investor is how to really measure, verify, and report the impact of investment in adaptation. That's maybe a problem when, even big multinational banks or bilateral agencies may face a challenge. They want to invest, but how to measure the impact? Is the money going down the drain?
Thank you. Okay, let's take one more from this side. So Steve Smith.
I was wondering to what extent you see mitigation and adaptation and loss and damage as completely different things in the negotiation. We heard yesterday that a lot of adaptation has actually to do with development. And if we're talking about transferring money between nations to assist with low carbon development, do you see funding for adaptation and funding for mitigation as entirely separate things or things that could be mixed together?
Okay, thank you. Do you want to take those?
Thank you. Let me take a couple, and then Harald can take the last one, perhaps. So, with regard to the responsibility for keeping us below 2 degrees, it was already agreed in the Framework Convention when we signed it and ratified it in the 1990s. And countries have not done what they promised to do. And so, not only are they responsible for the future, they're responsible for the loss and damage that has occurred by failure to keep their promises from 20 years ago. We've lost 20 years, we've lost 25 years of inaction, inadequate action, when promises were made and not kept. And so there's going to be a fallout for this, and the countries have to take responsibility as far as I'm concerned. With regard to Rabi's question on adaptation, measuring it and verifying it, it's a very valid question. In fact, the conference I mentioned on community-based adaptation that we held last year in Kenya, the theme was, how do we measure adaptation? It's not a trivial question at all, because adaptation to climate change often looks very much like development, and how do you then distinguish between what is adapting to climate change and what isn't just pure development? And it's not something we can easily find. In fact, in the Paris Agreement, we now have an adaptation goal. It's not clear what that goal will look like, and something that we need to think about. So there are some very interesting scientific challenges on how to measure adaptation, how to aggregate adaptation across scales into a global goal that I think the scientific community, especially young scientists who might be interested in pursuing this, might want to do. I'll leave the last question to Harald.
Yeah, just very briefly, I think it's a good question. I'm firmly of the view that we should think of mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage not as substitutes, but as complements in economic terms. I think it's an error to think of them. We need both and, not either or, and I think it's an error to trade them off against each other. And the way that I think that's reflected to some extent in the Paris outcome is having balance, and particularly I think the board of the Green Climate Fund has been very clear that not all the money, the risk is that all the money will go into mitigation and not enough into adaptation. And loss and damage I don't think is adequately funded at all in the Paris Agreement, and I think given the discussions yesterday, I think Saleem and I understand how that got there. That was the realpolitik approach, but from when Henry Shue sat here yesterday, it became very clear to me it's morally unjustifiable that you have loss and damage in there but not funded.
Okay, I think we'll actually try and squeeze in 2 more questions. So there's quite a few hands at the... Oh, we'll have one down here and then one from the back. If you want to take the first one down here.
Thank you. Saleem, you mentioned that poorest and most vulnerable communities also tend to have greater capacities and experience in adaptation and resilience, and that there's a lot to be learned from those of us who do not have to continually adapt and adjust to shocks and traumas and changes in our world. It'd be great to hear a little bit more about that and what could be learned across the globe from these communities. I also want to note that there is a micro depiction of disproportionate representation of people around the world, and particularly those working on collective action for social change and justice. that we're seeing here that we also see in the climate talks, and that's a heavy burden to carry. I'd like to see more people bringing different perspectives to the table so that questions such as Frank asked earlier about social transformation could be understood in a wider and deeper context.
Okay, and at the back, I think we'll have one from this side. So just next to the aisle, about 2/3 of the way up. Just here on the right. Just here on the right. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael Wayner, Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory in California. A number of us in the audience are involved in the attribution of the human role in individual extreme weather events. Last year's deadly heat wave in India was by one measure about 30 times more likely had humans not interfered in the climate system. For the heat wave in Pakistan, also last year, that number is closer to 1,000. A 1.5 degree world will be far more dangerous than today in this regard. I'd like to ask you, since you challenge scientists, physical climate scientists, how can this line of research be used in the loss and damage context?
Okay, do you want to share those?
So let me take the second question first. It's extremely important. You see, one of the, as I mentioned, the political sensitivities of this article on loss and damage in Paris was that the developed countries, particularly the US, did not want to talk about liability and compensation. And they felt that allowing the article to be in there would open them up to that. And if you follow the negotiations closely enough, you will know that they are the ones who inserted language on compensation and liability in the Paris Agreement, not in the agreement itself, but in the decision text, in the COP21 decision, saying that this agreement, this article, does not open the door to liability and compensation. They were so paranoid about it that they included in an agreement something that the agreement is not going to do, not what the agreement is going to do. But nevertheless, it is extremely important because we do need to have attribution properly. And if we are going to think about means of compensation for those that are affected by the impacts of climate change, then attribution is the key to unlocking ways of finding better ways of compensation. So I encourage the scientific community to be able to give us better, highly reliable attributions for climatic events, both rapid onset ones like the floods that you mentioned, but also slow onset ones like sea level rise as well. And to the point that you made about the disproportionate sort of imbalance, if you like, between North and South, this is true even in the scientific community. The scientific enterprises under the IPCC and others are global scientific enterprises, and this gathering has quite a few representatives from the global South, but I would hazard a guess that almost every single one of them would not have been able to come here with their own funding. They have been funded to come here. And so if you look at global funding for research, scientific research generally, climate change research more particularly, then I would hazard a guess that of the amount of global funding available, 90% comes from the rich world. And even for the 10% that may be available in the developing countries, 90% of that is China, India, Brazil, South Africa. And the poor, vulnerable countries that I mentioned are 1% of global funding. Not that we don't have researchers, not that we don't have scientists who are interested in getting involved in global science. They just don't have access to funds. Thank you.
Do you want to take the second question?
Experience on community-based?
Well, on the experience on community-based adaptation, I do really think that there are many communities in the developing countries, and I'll mention Bangladesh as one example, which I'm most familiar with, that are forging ahead on dealing with the impacts of climate change. So Bangladesh, yesterday's story about Bangladesh was one of the most vulnerable countries. That's an old story. It is now one of the most adaptive countries in the world. Bangladesh government has spent more than $500 million of its own money, not international money, own money, in implementing hundreds of projects across government, across communities to tackle the impacts of climate change. And we are moving up the knowledge scale on how to adapt to the impacts of climate change faster than any other country in the world. That's why I mentioned the fact that if you want to learn about adapting to climate change, it's not happening in Oxford, it's not happening in London, not happening in Harvard, it's happening in Bangladesh. So you should come to Bangladesh.